Hopefully all of you have been able to access the webinar room. I just want to say welcome. This is the fourth in a series of talks for the Expanding Empathy 2021 series. I'm hosting it here at the Rock Ethics Institute through the Moral Agency and Moral Development Initiative. It's also being co-sponsored by the Psychology Department, the Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lasana Harris, who is an associate professor of experimental psychology at University College London, where he runs the Boundaries of Social Cognition Lab. Let me just mention a little bit about Lasana's, Dr. Harris's research. He uses a social neuroscience approach to explore the neural correlates of person perception, prejudice, dehumanization, anthropomorphism, social learning, social emotions, empathy, and punishment. And he asks a broad range of really fascinating questions. How do we see people as less than human? How do we see non-human objects as human beings? How do we modulate and shape our affective responses to other people? How do we make decisions about right and wrong? He bridges, one of the most fascinating aspects of his program is he bridges disciplines from psychology, affective and cognitive neuroscience, philosophy of mind, developmental psychology, economics, law, policy, and brings it all together in really fascinating work. This is work that's been published in many of the journal's top fields, including psychological science, social personality and psychology science. And he's studied a lot of interesting topics that I think speak, excuse me, to a lot of the different interests of folks who are in attendance today. You know, the relationship between empathy and burnout, empathy and humanization. And so I've known Lasana for a long time, worked with him many years ago when I was a graduate student myself. And so it is a distinct honor to welcome him back here and give him the opportunity to talk about his work. So join me in welcoming Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Daryl, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me be a part of this series. So today I'm going to talk to you about some work that we've been doing in the lab over a period of time that's really focused on empathy as a proactive emotion regulation strategy. And what I find really interesting about this work are the variety of applications that it has in the real world. And today I'll sort of zoom in on one of those applications, particularly within the medical context, to try to explain how I think empathy operates. So before I begin, I always start by thanking my wonderful collaborators. A lot of the theoretical work I've been doing recently has been with Ophelia de Roy, who's a philosopher of mind located in Germany, in Munich. And then I'll take you through a series of experimental studies. The first studies I'll present, I did in collaboration with Daryl and Keith Payne at UNC. I will tell you about work I've been doing with my Spanish collaborators, Nera, Helena, Moises, and Urina. Some work I did with undergraduate students at both Duke University, Leiden University, and UCL, Natasha and Helen. And then some other work I've done with my Dutch collaborators, Gert-Jan and Lotte. And so science is really a team effort. That means that if you love anything here, they're all responsible, and they also take the blame if there's anything you don't like as well. And so I'll start off by giving you a theoretical overview about how we think about empathy and social cognition by extension in the lab. And I'll start off focusing in on social cognition. And so I like metaphors, and so I use one to try to explain how I think social cognition functions. And the metaphor that I use is a fishing metaphor. Now, full disclosure, I have never been fishing. So if there's anything I'm saying here that's dramatically incorrect, please let me know. But anyway, the way I think it works is that if you're fishing, I imagine that you're sitting in a boat holding a rod with a line extended into the water. And what you're doing is you're waiting to detect a particular type of movement along the line. And that's really movement associated with the fish biting your bait and attempting to swim away. And when you detect that movement, you engage in a very specific behavior, which is reeling in the fish. And so for me, that's a metaphor for social cognition. As we move through the social environment, we have different tugs at our metaphorical fishing line that's trying to trigger social cognitive processing or not engage social cognitive processing. And so this really is capsulated with this idea that we have the ability to regulate whether we engage social cognition or not. And by social cognition, I mean think about or consider other people's minds. Now, right away, this is a somewhat controversial position because traditionally in social psychology, we've described social cognition as more of an automatic process, something that spontaneously happens when we're in the presence of other people. But what I'm going to argue is that that's not always the case, right? There are instances where we fail to think about other people's minds. Now, the other thing that's relevant from a social psychological point of view is that the context matters. So if you're fishing on a calm day, the movement you're trying to detect is going to be different than if you're fishing on a windy day. Similarly, the social context can determine both whether you engage social cognition or not to a target that you encounter, and also the content of that social cognition. So what you think is going on inside of that person's head. So to drive this point home more broadly, I use another example. So in the days when we could all travel, imagine that you were sitting in the airport lounge. This is the departures lounge of Heathrow Airport here in London, and you see someone crying. You might make the inference that they're sad, right? Because maybe they're saying goodbye to a loved one. But if you saw crying behavior in the arrivals hall at Heathrow Airport, you might think that the person is happy, right? They're welcoming someone they haven't seen in quite some time. So exactly the same behavior can produce two different inferences about what's going on inside of that person's mind. And so the context matters for flexibility as well. And so this idea of flexible social cognition or flexible or social cognition as a type of flexible hypothesis testing is something I've been developing with Ophelia over the last few years. And what we basically do is use it as a way to try to answer a question that's fundamental in the social cognition literature, and that's what makes human social cognition special. And by special, I mean sort of distinctive and unique compared to non-human animal social cognition. Now, most of the theorizing in the literature that talks about the specialness of human social cognition focuses on the contents of our cognitions. So it talks about things like humans' ability to take other people's perspectives or to infer their mental states or norm compliance, for instance. Or they talk about special mechanisms, right? The fact that we have special brain areas that are social, we have unique social wiring or unique social algorithms. And these explanations, we argue, can only take you so far in sort of understanding what's really unique about human social cognition, because they're what we call first order characterizations, right? There's always some theory that people have, like deception, that eventually gets dispelled by a clever animal researcher who designs a paradigm that demonstrates that non-human animals can also engage in this type of cognitive process. And so they tend to sort of ebb and flow in the literature. What we're arguing is that in order to understand human uniqueness and distinctiveness, we need to consider a second order characterization, which is what we're calling flexibility. Now, flexibility here is an umbrella term that actually means three distinct things. The first type of flexibility that we're thinking about is what we call variable extension. So this is our ability as human beings to see another human being and fail to consider their mind, something we call dehumanization. And a lot of the research in my lab has looked at this phenomena, but also our ability to attribute minds to things that don't have them or to anthropomorphize. And I've also done a lot of work on this in the lab. But beyond variable extensions, we think there are two other types of flexibility. One of them is what we call revisable and open contents. And so again, this captures the concept of retrospective updating, our ability as human beings to revise the contents we attributed to somebody else's mind. So for instance, if you are sitting in your office and having a meeting with someone, again, in the days when you could have done that, and you notice the person glancing at their watch, you might think that maybe they're worried about being late for an important appointment, and so they're keeping a track of time. However, on your way home, you may revisit that scenario in your head and decide that, well, perhaps they were just trying to signal to me that I was rambling on and on and on. And so they were giving me a cue to stop talking, right? So they were being a little rude rather than being worried about time. So again, with no additional information, we can come up with a different explanation. And the reason we think that's possible is because people have the ability to form multiple probable attributions when we encounter people's behavior. So in the context, for instance, of stereotyping in social psychology, the narrative has always been that when I encounter someone else, I first categorize them based on their perceived social group membership. And then if I have sufficient information and resources and motivation, I go beyond that categorization to an inference that's more individuating or based on sort of traits rather than their stereotypical categorical associations. What we've been arguing recently in a theoretical paper is that, well, actually what we think happens is that when you encounter another human being, you have multiple probable attributions, right? So the stereotypes and the trait inferences are both active. And depending on the context that you're in, right, and the societal context prioritizing social group membership, you're going to go with the stereotypes, but it doesn't mean the traits aren't active as well. So that's a different type of flexibility. The final type of flexibility is what we call monitoring of social uncertainty. And so this has to do with impression management concerns, sometimes known as reputation management concerns. The idea that as human beings, we have this metacognitive ability to check whether somebody else is forming a positive impression of us or not. And this is something evolutionarily that was important, right, for maintaining our status within our social groups and our hierarchies. And we see it today in the way that people care about the opinions and attitudes of even complete strangers. So we don't want to be rude to someone we will probably never have an interaction with again. We argue because that stuff is sort of baked into our psychology. And then there's what we call anticipated reduction. So this idea that we have the ability to interpret social signals in multiple ways. So in one example, imagine that a woman is waving to a bus driver while standing at the bus stop. The bus driver interprets that wave as a signal to stop because perhaps the woman wants to get on the bus, whereas waving in other contexts may mean that the person is just saying hello. So our ability to flexibly interpret the different social signals in our environment, I think, also highlights another component of this theory. So this idea that we've developed has a number of implications. The first implication is that the difference between humans and non-human animals isn't necessarily about one type of representation. So it's not about a unique skill, for instance, but it's also, I take this to mean that as human beings, like I described with the signaling example, right, we can interpret the same thing in a variety of different ways. And that's an interesting implication to consider. The second implication is that even non-special skills become special. And this basically means that we don't really differ from non-human animals in the types of psychological skills we have, but the way we apply them as human beings makes them appear to be special. So if you take the case of Pavlovian conditioning, right, which was first discovered with dogs, right, a non-human animal. Humans can also be Pavlovian conditioned, but in humans it manifests as things like stereotypes, whereas in non-human animals it doesn't look like that type of a special skill. The third implication is that the dark side of human interactions is now better explained. And so typically people talk about monsters who commit heinous or evil acts. But what we're saying is that we're all capable of engaging in these behaviors simply by regulating social cognition. And that's because social cognition is required to trigger moral and empathic concern. And we're going to dive into empathy quite shortly. But just to take sort of a morality example, this cartoon says at the critical move, the super chess computer went blank, once again proving humankind's superiority over machines. And if you look at the bottom left of the panel, the guy just unplugs the computer. Now, this is a cartoon meant to be funny because it's a computer. If it were a COVID patient hooked up to a respirator, it would now be a moral violation, right? And so morality is only relevant in the domain of human-human interactions. There's some theorizing by people like Peter Singer, who says that we need to expand our moral boundaries to include animals as well. And so veganism is often based on this principle. But the idea is that once you start considering suffering, that's something that requires you to engage social cognition to get inside of someone's head. You could short circuit that process by simply regulating social cognition. The same is going to apply for empathy, as we'll talk about in just a moment. And then finally, the last implication is the social wiring hypothesis should be paid attention to. And so this makes sense for me as a social neuroscientist. What I'm showing you here is the result of a meta-analysis by Matthew Rushwood's group, which basically shows in panel C, brain areas that become engaged during social cognitive inferences. And these include medial prefrontal cortex, but also the precuneus and the parietal cingulate, as well as parts of the temporal lobe extending from temporal parietal junction all the way to the anterior temporal pole, including superior temporal sulcus. So there's this massive neocortical network that underlies our social cognitive abilities. And this review paper did a couple of wonderful things. First, it highlighted the difficulty we have with jargon in psychology. So panel D shows theory of mind, which is essentially the same thing, but has often been thought of as different. It drives the same activation. And then panel B in red shows what happens in the default mode network. This is what happens when you take a person, stick them in an MRI machine without any specific task. Your brain is never shut off. It's never really at rest. What happens in this condition is that you end up mind wandering. And research by people like Jonathan Schooler has suggested that while you're mind wandering, you're examining social relationships, you're considering your place within social hierarchy. So you're thinking about other people's minds, right? You're wondering, what is the experimenter going to do to me? Why does he have me lying in this dark place? Who was that cute person I saw in the hallway? Do I really need to have dinner with my roommate's parents after this, right? And so this implication basically suggests that understanding the brain is crucial for understanding this flexibility. And so in a lot of our research, we've used this pattern of brain activity as an index to whether social cognition has been engaged or not. But what I'm going to focus on today is empathy as the theme of the symposium. And I want to begin by sort of addressing some of this disciplinary jargon issues that we have in psychology by giving you my definition of empathy. Now, I show there are different definitions depending on the researchers that you speak to. So it's important, I think, to sort of identify what it is that I mean when I say empathy. So for me, empathy is an emotional response. And I'll give you a scenario to sort of capture what it is that I think happens. So let's imagine that there's a person walking down the street and they encounter a homeless person. A lot of our early experiments focused on homeless people. This is a scenario that might trigger an empathic response. But there's actually a cascade of psychological processes that happens before we get to what I call empathy. So first of all, there's an appraisal of the situation, right? There's a diagnosis of this as a helping situation, right? And that appraisal is key because if the person doesn't make that appraisal, they can continue walking on by and you don't get any further in this cascade of processing. But once there's a recognition of a helping situation, there's a prediction, we argue, about what would happen if I decided to help, if I decided to take the time to engage with this human being. And that prediction then results in the actual mental state inference, where we consider that person's suffering. And so that's what I've been calling social cognition. And the social cognition is what triggers the empathic response, which is the emotional component. And so you'll often see people differentiate cognitive and affective empathy, talking about this inference versus the actual empathic response. I consider empathy to be just an emotion. Emotions require cognition. And so it's still just an emotion in my point of view. And after you have this empathic response, then you have this sort of pro-social motivation to help. But you also might experience personal distress because you're resonating with the person's suffering. That's what empathy is. And that may be personally distressing for you as well. And so in the research that I'm going to show you, I'm going to focus on just a few of these cognitive processes and affective processes. Moreover, this situation is also governed by the social context. So if this person is in a hurry versus if they're just casually having a stroll, that's going to determine which of these processes get engaged in and what's the content of those processes as well, right? So we haven't gotten rid of the social context it's still hanging around. And so, like I said, I'm going to focus mainly on the prediction and the inference part as these precursors to empathy, and show you how they can affect whether empathy actually gets triggered or not. So let's start by talking about the predictive part of it. So there's a wonderful set of literature in the psychology literature that talks about charity donations, and they stumbled upon this phenomena where they often find that people are more likely to give to one starving kid, for instance, versus a bunch of starving kids. And so researchers have sort of referred to this as people as statistics, right? So here's data from Deb Small and George Lowenstein and Slovik showing this effect. So if you have an identifiable victim, which is the one person, right, that leads to more donations than if you have what's called a statistical victim, that is many people. Now you can turn the identifiable person into a statistic by associating statistical information with that person, and that often reduces the effect. Darrell Cameron had the interesting idea that there may be another interpretation for this result. And what might be happening is that you imagine that many people suffering is a lot of suffering. Therefore, you're more motivated to help one person because you feel like that's a situation you're better able to deal with. So you make a prediction. So in his study, he showed, for instance, people having a help request where there was either one victim or 8 victims. And here what he's measuring instead of donation amount is compassion towards the victim. And what he finds is that he can reverse that effect if there's no help request, right? So if I'm not expected to do something to help these people suffering, then I demonstrate that I have much more compassion for the statistical case, right? The 8 victims. So this is really suggestive evidence that people are making predictions about the consequences of engaging social cognition and the subsequent empathic and compassionate processes that might result from it. So this idea about people predicting what a social interaction is going to be like is actually one that's been around in the literature for quite some time. So going back to the 1980s, Steve Newberg and Susan Fisk did some really interesting research where they put their participants through something they called a patient reintegration program. So they told their participants that in this experiment, they're going to meet people who have been hospitalized for a long time. And their job as the participant was to have a conversation with that person to get them used to sort of having conversation with strangers again after being away for such a long time. Maybe that's something we all need after being locked away with COVID. What they manipulated was who the patient was. So in one condition, they said it's a recently released heart patient. In another condition, they said it's a recently released schizophrenic. And the schizophrenic label here is stigmatized, where people tend to have more negative reactions and expect such interactions to go more negatively than if you were talking to a heart patient. They then surreptitiously videotaped these participants. And what they looked at was essentially the amount of fidgeting that these participants had. They also manipulated outcome dependence in this study, but that's sort of irrelevant for the point we're trying to make. And what you basically see is if you look at the obtained amount of fidgeting, this was coded on a 4-point scale. People start fidgeting way more for the schizophrenic than for the heart patient. And if you compare that to a no label condition where they simply say hospital patient, right, again, you see a bunch of fidgeting there, consistent with negative ideas we may have about hospital patients in general. So this schema triggered affect, as they call it, was really some initial evidence that we're making these predictions before engaging in social interactions with other people. So in my lab, we follow this effect up. This is actually data from my time as a doctoral student with Susan, where we basically capitalize on this idea. We wanted to find evidence that indeed people were making these expectations. So we did a brain imaging study where we first provided participants with information about a specific behavior, like he reads to sick children at the hospital. And then we took advantage of a phenomena in the dispositional attribution literature, which basically argued that certain combinations of information push people towards sort of thinking about the person's mind or engaging social cognition. So if we gave people low consensus information, so hardly anyone reads to sick kids, high distinctiveness information, he reads to almost any other sick person in the hospital, low distinctiveness information, and then high consistency information. In the past, he would almost always read to sick children in the hospital. It leads people to make a dispositional attribution. So in our study, we loaded this information in, and then we showed you a picture of the person that either confirmed the expectation that was informed by the behavior or disconfirmed the expectation. And then we asked participants to tell us how responsible the person was for engaging in that behavior. So what we're going to do is focus on just this social target picture during our brain imaging results. And what we basically see is that regardless of whether we violate a warmth dimension, so something like reading to sick kids, or a competence dimension, we were able to drive activity in this triad, a part of the brain involved in making predictions, prediction error signals. And so this was suggestive evidence that, again, participants are perhaps revising their expectations, updating their expectations to better match the information that they had. That is the picture of who the person is that actually engaged in this behavior. So again, we have evidence of this predictive quality sort of happening. So Daryl and I did a study while he was at UNC as a doctoral student, where we really wanted to go after this idea, but now in the context of empathy and dehumanization as dependent variables. And what we did is we replicated a classic Dan Batson sort of appeal for help paradigm, where we told participants they were going to see different appeals from homeless people for assistance, but either the homeless person sort of suffered from a chronic illness, which is less stigmatizing than someone who is an injection drug user. So again, what we're predicting is that in this injection drug user condition, we're going to see more dehumanization as people make the prediction that this appeal is going to be uncomfortable and difficult to watch. So we measured anticipated exhaustion. So we asked our participants, right, how emotionally exhausting do you think this video is going to be to watch? And what we saw is that the high stigmatized group was the one where participants reported more exhaustion. The degree of suffering we told the participants the person had didn't really matter in this manipulation. Most importantly, this effect was moderated by empathy. So it's only participants who were high in empathic concern who really showed this pattern of results. Participants low in empathic concern didn't show a difference in anticipated exhaustion. We also measured mind attribution as a proxy for dehumanization. So high numbers means you're getting inside of the head more than lower numbers. And again, you see the pattern that you would predict, where participants are engaging less in thinking about the mind of the person. They're regulating their social cognition in the high stigma compared to the low stigma condition. In a follow-up study, we wanted to better manipulate this prediction. And so we told participants that either the appeal that they were about to see was rated by an earlier pilot study as either exhausting and tiring, consistent with what we think the default expectation is, or inspiring and rewarding, right? Suggesting that there is going to be no emotional cost to looking at this appeal. Again, we're measuring mind attribution as a proxy for dehumanization. And again, we're finding that participants who have been told that this is going to be highly exhausting is showing less mind attribution than those who haven't been told that. So to summarize at this point, what we've demonstrated so far is that predictions about the mind of the other person can impact whether empathy gets engaged or not. And here what we're looking at is dehumanization as a way of short-circuiting this empathic processing. And so we think this might help explain why empathy avoidance can be this proactive emotion regulation strategy. So if you make the prediction that you're entering a situation where there's empathy required, and particularly if you feel you don't have the resources to deal with it, then simply shutting down social cognition, regulating whether you get in that mind or not, might be a way of short-circuiting that emotional empathic response. In the rest of the studies that I'm going to show you, we're going to examine this phenomenon in a medical context, and we're going to move beyond the prediction to the inference stage of things. So in recent work I did with my colleagues in Spain, looking at emergency room nurses, we did a big correlational study where we gave these nurses a questionnaire to complete that had a number of different measures, including the interpersonal reactivity index, which is a popular measure of empathy. Now, what's nice about the IRI is it breaks empathy up into different components. And so we looked at how these different components related to a number of different outcomes. And I'll just show you some of that data now. So in one of the more interesting models that we pulled out of this data set, we looked at the different components of the IRI: perspective taking, which is this social cognitive mentalizing inference component, empathic concern, and then personal distress. So we think of, so they're sort of ordered here in the way I think the cascade of processing happens. And what we were able to show is we also measured sort of mental state inferences of patients and then their sense of personal accomplishment. And what we were able to demonstrate was a mediation such that empathic concern was mediated through the mental state inferences in terms of its ability to predict personal accomplishments. So lots of medical professionals get into medicine because they're high in empathic concern, right? They're high in trait empathy. They want to help other people. And that gives them a feeling of personal accomplishment. But in our study, that relationship was mediated through their ability to get inside the minds of the patients or not, right? More evidence suggesting that the cascade I've described might actually be possible. Now, perspective taking wasn't fully mediated by mental state inferences, and there was no relationship of personal distress to their ability to infer mental state inferences, which I take as evidence that, again, we're seeing personal distress occurring later on in this process. But again, we have here suggestive evidence that that cascade might be occurring. Now, that work was really inspired by a lot of work that Jean Dessetti at Chicago had done, looking at medical care professionals, where he was finding a lot of similar results. So in one of his more famous studies, he showed medical care professionals, so doctors and then lay participants, video of some of people being stuck by Q-tips or cotton swabs, or being stuck by needles. And he did this while scanning their brains using EEG, so getting brainwave activity. And what he was able to demonstrate in the controls was you'd find a differentiation between these two videos at a waveform known as the P3 or the P300 associated with sort of conflict monitoring, but you didn't see such a differentiation in the physicians. He also saw a difference with a very early waveform, the N110. And so if you did some correlations where you're looking at the control regular participants in the open circles and the physicians in the gray circles, what you see is that measures of pain intensity, so these are subjective ratings collected from the participants, are positively correlated with the N110 signal in the controls, and measures of unpleasantness of the video, again, are positively correlated with this P300 signal, but there's no such correlation for the physicians, right, the professionals, suggesting that they found a way to sort of regulate the negative impact of watching such videos. Now, we did a bunch of studies that basically follow up on this basic effect. And the first one I'll tell you about, we used the popular game Operation. And we took advantage again of a classic Batson manipulation. So in one condition, we showed participants a distressing video and told them to respond naturally, assuming that they would feel distress and some degree of empathic concern for looking at this video. In another condition, while watching the distressing video, we instructed our participants to maintain a detached perspective. So sort of approach it as if you were a journalist, for instance, and you're just trying to report the facts. Don't get caught up in the feelings of the people. Our manipulation check suggested that this was effective, so participants reported more negative affect in the respond naturally condition than the detached perspective. We then had them play the game Operation, and the instruction simply was to do it as fast as they could without making any errors. And what we're going to do is look at their data over time. So they did this they had three different attempts to solve the whole operation, and we sort of timed them. And so we created an index that was a combination of the time it took and the number of errors they make. And what you basically see is that over time, the low empathy participants are improving. So here, lower numbers mean improvement. They're doing it faster with less errors. But in the high empathy condition, they're basically staying flat. So there's no improvement as you go through the different trials. Again, suggestive evidence that empathy can sort of get in the way this time of performing a physical task. We followed this up with a bunch of other studies where we bought a bunch of fake rubber arms and had our participants stitch these fake rubber arms. Now, these are arms that medical students will often use to practice their suturing. And in the final study in this sequence, we actually did this with medical students. But in this initial study, which we ran in the Netherlands, we just took regular people off the street and had them do the stitching task. Again, like the game of Operation, we had the same empathy manipulation. So they're either high empathy or low empathy. And we're giving them a number of requirements, right? We're telling them to do this as quickly as possible, to try to keep the stitches evenly spaced, et cetera, et cetera. And what we basically see in one study is we measured emotion regulation using this sort of James Gross reappraisal suppression measure. We didn't see a correlation with improved performance. So as they go from one trial to the next with the emotion regulation scores, but we did see a correlation with emotion suppression. So the more participants reported that they are trait emotion suppressors, the more they improved in their performance. In another study, we looked at the actual performance in the stitching based on this empathy manipulation. And what we basically found is that the participants in the low empathy condition were better able to keep their stitches evenly spaced. So on this graph, lower numbers means a lower standard deviation in the gap between the stitches. So the stitches are more evenly spaced. But that's not happening in the high empathy condition. They're performing the task less well. So that's average distance between the stitches and this sort of standard deviation. So I jumped the gun there a bit, but it's the same basic pattern. So our participants are basically performing the task less well in the low empathy condition. In another version of this task, we wanted to bring in context. So as I told you before, context can have an impact in the extent to which people flexibly are able to engage social cognition. And so we basically came up with two contexts. One was a sort of more social, relaxed context akin to a lounge. The other was a medical context, right? A medical office where people would actually be performing such things like stitching rubber arms. And in this study, we used medical students here in London at UCL. And so we basically dressed up our lab rooms to look like a medical office somewhat. So we hung a bunch of medical posters and had a stethoscope and medical books and little skulls and stuff like that. In another condition, we dressed up another room to be more comfortable. So we put on a tablecloth and we put comfortable cushions and pictures of people in the room and scented candles. And what we want to see is, will participants, these times it's medical students, will they complete the task more efficiently in one of these two contexts? What we basically find is that if you look at our control participants, so they are not people who are in medical school, they do the task better in the personal context than the medical context. In this so in this particular case, again, lower numbers means better performance. So the medical context is stressing them out more, if you will. And we see the same pattern in our first year and second year and third year medical students. Now, in the British medical schools, you start your rotations in the hospitals after year 3. So from year 4 onwards, you're in the hospitals where you're now getting experience working with actual patients. And in those older students, we see a reversal of this pattern, where again, they're doing better in this task in the medical context versus the more personal context. And that's just repeating this data across the different dependent variable. Again, you see the same pattern, where it's only after they have this sort of clinical exposure and the hidden curriculum, as they call it in medical school, sinks in, that we see this flip where they're doing the task better. Now, Jean de Settier and his group also had a very similar set of studies where they also manipulated context. And so they had, this time it was nurses imagining, engaging in each of the tasks that they're showing in these pictures in either a hospital context with a patient or a home context where they were performing this in a friend or a familiar other. So the red is the home context, the blue is the hospital context. They had them rate their sort of valence and arousal with the task. And what they found was, again, their years of work experience only correlated with valence and arousal ratings when they considered doing the task in the hospital context, not the home context, which again is consistent with some other results we have showing correlations between trait empathy and work experience in our nurses in Spain. So it's nice to see the convergence. They also did brain imaging of these nurses. And what they discovered was that in these brain regions, the anterior insula, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the right temporal parietal junction, the latter two being parts of the social cognition network, the insula being important for interoception, a different facet of social cognition. This is knowing something about yourself. Again, they found there was more activity in these brain regions when you compared painful to neutral stimuli. So this is more activation to the painful stimuli just in the home context, right? It's only in that context where you're getting this sort of increased response to the painful stimuli. In the hospital context, there isn't really a difference between these two stimuli. If you look at correlations with activity in these brain regions, again, you see that it's only in the hospital context where these brain regions are correlating with their work experience and their arousal ratings. So in these graphs, what they're doing is extracting the signal from these brain regions, and they're correlating valence ratings with work experience relative to these signals. And again, it's only in the hospital context, not the home context. They also did mediation analyses to see if these brain regions mediated the relationship between work experience and valence rating, for instance, and they did. And also they mediated the relationship between work experience and arousal ratings. Again, more evidence suggesting that there's something in the context that's cueing participants to engage social cognitive processing or not when they're thinking about these painful inducing tasks. So again, to provide another interim summary, the context impacts whether medical professionals seem to engage empathy or not. And we think this has important implications for how healthcare professionals are trained. So currently, there's something called the hidden curricula, which I referred to before, which is all about getting students accustomed to blood and death and gore. And so there are wonderful anecdotes about how this is accomplished in different medical schools. But we think what might actually be needed is more training focused on how people can regulate these empathic responses. Because even though I didn't show you burnout in this data, in some of the other work we're doing in Spain, we're really targeting burnout and finding correlations between burnout as well. And Jean Desetti has similar relationships in his work as well. All right, so with the last 5 minutes or so that I have, what I think I'm going to do next is talk about some more recent social exclusion data we have, which you can think of as sort of a consequence of failing to engage empathic consent. And I'll show you some brain imaging data we have that's, again, really consistent with this story I've been sharing with you. And so in these studies, what we did is we used the classic cyberball manipulation. So for those of you who don't know, cyberball is this virtual ball tossing game where the participant appears as one of 3 players and is participating in a game where they're throwing a ball between the 3 of them. What usually happens to promote social exclusion is that one of the players gets cut out from the ball tosses. So for instance, player A and player C might decide, we're just going to throw the balls to each other and exclude player B. This leads to severe negative affect, for instance. In our version of the study, what we did is we manipulated the group membership of these different participants. So the participant is always player A, and either they're playing against somebody who has the same color as them. So these are avatars in a virtual environment. And it's literally an avatar that's colored the same as them, or an avatar, and the other avatar, the one that gets excluded, is a different color, so an out-group member. Or in a control condition, everybody has a different color, so group membership isn't really salient. And what we demonstrate in these studies is we're looking for the amount of exclusion. So do the participants go along with the exclusion? So what happens is player C starts throwing the ball just to the participant who's player A. And we're going to measure how many times player A starts throwing the ball back to player B to compensate, right, for this exclusion that's happening, because now player C is never throwing the ball to player B. And what we find is that in the control condition, right, people are much more likely to go along with the exclusion compared to the minimal group condition, where player C, for instance, who's being excluded, belongs to the same group as they do. And this is something we replicated over a couple of different studies. If we look in the brain, exclusion versus inclusion, we find parts of the anterior cingulate involved in that, which has been associated with things like social pain in the past. and activity in that brain region tracks with the percentage of throws to the excluded player. So the more you had activity in this brain region that's been associated with social pain, the more likely you were to include the person who was being excluded. And if we sort of extract the betas and break it up based on minimal group versus the control group, again, this effect was stronger in the minimal group condition versus the control conditions. So to sum up what I've been talking about thus far, our main argument is that social cognition is not always engaged in the presence of other people, right? Human beings have this special ability to flexibly engage social cognition. And one of the arenas we might want to do that is when we make predictions about empathy that's being required, right? So we can regulate empathic responses by disengaging this social cognition. And that's the link to dehumanization, because for us, sort of failing to engage social cognition in the presence of a person is akin to dehumanization. So for us then, empathy avoidance becomes this proactive emotion regulation strategy. So we can short circuit one of these processes in this cascade of psychological processes before we get to empathy, and that's a way of regulating that emotional experience. All right, and what we've been arguing more recently, and we've been doing some recent work looking at this, is that this may be able to happen within the same social interaction. So I have ignored time course in this talk, even though I presented you a cascade of processing. And so we're doing some work in our lab now where we're trying to understand what's the timing of this. Is it possible to switch this on and off, so to regulate when empathy may be required or not? So going back to the medical professionals who have a really difficult job, if I've just met a patient for the first time and I'm trying to diagnose them, so they've just come into my office, I need to be empathic, right? So that I make a connection with that person and they feel like they're being cared for and respected. But if I then realize that what's required is an injection, let's say, immediately, I might have to shut off empathy while I'm sticking them with the needle and then turn it back on again to see what impact that injection might have had on them and their subjective experience. So we think that you can do this in a fairly narrow time scale, and we're doing some research now to try to further unpack that. And then finally, as a social psychologist, social context matters, and it informs the appraisals that we make in terms of the prediction, whether we make the inference or not, even whether we determine that it's a helping scenario or not. So there's a big contextual impact here, and we demonstrated this in some of our medical decision-making studies or medical performance studies as well. So I think I will stop there. That's bang on 45 minutes according to my timer. Thank you for your attention, and open up the floor to questions.
Thanks. That was really interesting, really provocative talk. And we do have one question that's rolled in. Folks who have questions for Dr. Harris, please do ask away, and I'll try to get to them in order received. One, and please also do use the Q&A function for questions as opposed to hand raising. So Julian asks, who you talked with earlier, asks, he says, the medical context studies are really interesting with those operationalizations. Have you thought of empathy being ineffective for performance that benefits another person in the absence of the other person's participation, such as medical operations, surgery, but maybe more effective where there is the requirement for more mutuality and cooperation? So like things like therapy and other forms of care. In other words, how does the type of medical intervention interaction matter for some of these effects? And though Julian also notes perhaps he's wrong, you see something similar with the therapist-client dynamic, and the overarching consideration is hierarchy or dependency. So yeah, how does the medical context matter?
That's a really great question. So I've had the therapy thought for quite some time, and recently at a conference I saw some data from a lab in France where they looked at this empathy and sort of therapy within the context of brain activations. And it actually goes the same way as the surgery example, right? And so the more the therapist was able to regulate their empathy, the better outcomes the clients had in that therapeutic relationship. And I think that's because what you have to do as a therapist, I'm making this up because I'm not a therapist, is you have to really understand the person, but you don't necessarily have to feel empathic for them, because again, it might lead to the same burnout effects. So I think what medical professionals have to do is appear to be empathic or communicate empathy to their clients while not actually experiencing that empathy themselves. So again, because I'm thinking of empathy as just the emotional component, I'm not saying they don't need to understand what their client is experiencing, right? That's the inference component, that social cognitive bit, that more core cognitive part. So we're all going to need that. But what I then have to do is find a way of not letting that trigger empathic concern, which is going to be exhausting if my job requires that I deal with suffering constantly. And so I think all medical professionals have found a way to do that. For instance, it's one of the reasons why I never became a clinical psychologist. Like, I couldn't shut off the empathy. I would hear about somebody's problems and I couldn't help but feel that sort of emotional resonance. And that's very counterproductive, because then I get caught up in that feeling. And even though I want to help them, that's a constraint on my cognitive resources as well. So it makes it less likely that I come up with a solution that's really beneficial to them. So there's at least some suggestive evidence out there that even in therapeutic relationships, it helps to be detached and disconnected. But I think you still want to communicate empathy to your client, right? Because we know that a lack of empathy is one of the biggest predictors of litigation in medical context, right? As someone going to a doctor for help, I want the doctor to empathize with me. But that may not be what's in the best interest of getting me more healthy, and also in the doctor's best interest as well. So at least there's some research that suggests that's the case, but I haven't done those studies myself. A really fascinating question.
So building off this thread, there's a couple of more questions on this particular topic. So Tariq asks, for students or doctors who are naturally detached at baseline, what has been shown effective for switching on empathic modes and perspective taking?
I think this is where the context matters, right? And so I think, so if you think about a surgeon, there's this process they go through of washing their hands and cleaning their bodies and putting on the mask and the gown that I think puts them into the mindset where empathy needs to be regulated. If I walk into my doctor's office, it's usually staid and cold. It has all of the equipment and thing in there, and that might cue me to suggest empathy needs to be regulated. So I think that the physical spaces we operate and the things we do to our bodies to prepare for treatment might actually be helping in terms of the medical context. The whole reason we got into the medical context in the first place is because I gave a talk in PBS about empathy many years ago. And afterwards, a neurosurgeon rang me up and he said he thinks that they may be suffering from what I've been talking about. So I spoke about dehumanization and empathy. And he proceeded to give me all these anecdotes about the best neurosurgeons in the world are the biggest, most horrible people, right? Like, they have a really hard time establishing and maintaining social relationships. And they're just nasty individuals, but they're really great neurosurgeons, right? They're the one you want to sort of deal with you if you've had a stroke or an aneurysm. And that's really what started me thinking. So I feel like in terms of the trait level, there may be some people who get into medical care because they don't have that strong empathic concern. And they are better at sort of regulating this empathic concern. And so that makes them better able to be successful in the medical career. The problem is, at least here in the UK, empathy is one of the things they test for in admitting you to medical school. So they're recruiting highly empathic, trait empathy people. And then they proceed to sort of beat that empathy out of them as they go through the training and the experiences. So there has to be a better way to approach medical practice. And what we've been doing in these other labs I've mentioned is just beginning to understand that process. But I personally believe there has to be a better way. And what might matter is not your trait empathy per se. So not your ability, but your propensity. How likely are you to trigger this process or not? So we've been making that distinction recently in our lab. So instead of focusing on empathic ability, are some people better at regulating it, right? Or so are some people better able, regardless of their ability, to not engage empathy or not? So propensity as an alternative. So that might help answer our question.
And it certainly is very interesting with the ability propensity distinction, which is definitely resonates with some of the other questions. And some of the debates we've discussed in the past in our own past work that you mentioned. I mean, to the degree that there are, from what I've read, medical programs that are incorporating empathy interventions, and as you noted, recruiting on the basis of empathy, and then facing structural demands that push against empathy. Just the sorts of intrapersonal conflicts as a person navigates empathy within that environment do seem like it would be fairly exhausting and laborious.
Absolutely, and at least we have some data in our Spanish data where there's a correlation between years of being an ER nurse and trait empathy, right? So the ones who've been working longer have lower levels of empathy. So I think of it as the experiences have sort of taken it out of you, because again, if you make social connections and you're being empathic, some of these people are going to die, right? Which is going to be crushing to you if you're socially connected to them. Moreover, everybody's suffering, especially in the emergency room, right? And it's not only them, the patient who's suffering, but you have concerned family members and friends. And so there's a lot of emotional baggage coming along with these occupations. And we have to train medical professionals to properly handle that, mainly because we think it impacts their performance, as we demonstrated in our lab studies, but also for their own psychological well-being. They have to be able to disconnect. And I think we've seen lots of anecdotal reports of the frontline healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic being emotionally exhausted from the sort of struggle of dealing with COVID patients. And there really isn't anything set up in medical context that helps them with that. So I think we could do better, and that's kind of the focus of this research as well.
Yeah, no, certainly the COVID-19 context does add another layer, given its scope too. Building off that, so Fred has a couple of questions. I'm going to try to integrate them. So in response to your point about the neurosurgeons who might be callous or might seems lacking empathy or something, he suggests that although downregulating empathy might be an effective strategy, could another effective strategy perhaps be acceptance, like in a mindfulness sense, to feel empathy and still perform effectively without downregulating it? Fred's other point from earlier was just in thinking through that also, like the role of emotion contagion in particular in the process.
Yeah, so first dealing with the mindfulness point. So we did some other work looking at homelessness in New York City with some clinicians there. And what we basically did is we had our participants go through either a mindfulness intervention training for 2 weeks, a cognitive restructuring training, so sort of CBT, what you traditionally would have done in clinical psychology, and then just a control condition where they did memory tasks. And around the training, we sort of measured their perceptions of homeless people and the extent to which they dehumanize. We didn't measure empathy specifically. And as part of this training, we sort of instructed them, because they are on the streets of New York, there are tons of homeless people, to put the training in practice every time they encountered a homeless person. So it wasn't just 2 weeks of mindfulness meditation, but they also had like homework assignments where they would have to go out and face these people. And what we basically found were the following. So we measured emotion, so how disturbing homeless people were, how much negative affect it generated. And what we found is that in the CBT group, they had lower levels of affect after the intervention compared to the controls. But the mindfulness group didn't. They had the same levels of emotion. In some cases, they weren't higher than the controls, but they were much higher than the CBT group. But if we looked at dehumanization, the CBT group was still dehumanizing, while the mindfulness group wasn't. So related to this idea of acceptance, what we thought happened in that study is that what the mindfulness did is it allowed you to be accepting of this negative affect. So you didn't get rid of the negative affect, but the negative affect didn't have quite the same impact. So I didn't have to then dehumanize this person. I could get inside of their heads, understand their suffering, accept the negative impact, but that didn't seem to have the negative effect. So that's one study in one narrow context, but absolutely we think that that is a possibility. And so we're following up on that now, trying to understand what is it about mindfulness per se that allows people to be able to tolerate the negative affect while not having to dehumanize as a strategy. And I think that ties in really nicely with the work that I showed you where we got a correlation with emotion suppression. So if you take classic models of emotion regulation. There are really three ways of regulating your emotion. So suppression doesn't work, right? Because the affect comes back really strongly. And we think in our study, we saw that suppression effect because these weren't medical professionals, right? These were people off the street doing stitching of rubber arms. So they thought just suppress. There's reappraisal, which forces you to engage with the stimulus and then think differently about the stimulus. And that's akin to what happens with CBT training, right? And then finally, there's what's called distraction. And what happens in distraction is you don't even engage with the stimulus. So before you get to the stimulus, you put your attention somewhere else. And we're trying to fit this mindfulness result within that emotion regulation framework. And it doesn't fit into that framework because they're not regulating their emotions. And so that's suggesting there may be perhaps a fourth approach where you don't distract from the stimulus, you don't attempt to suppress the emotions, you don't reappraise the stimulus, but you let the emotions come on. And then there's something you can do to then deal with that emotion so it doesn't have the negative consequence. And so that's something we're actively considering now in our lab as well. Regarding the emotion contagion, with the emotion resonance, absolutely. So in my understanding, that's what empathy is. It's that resonance with the suffering. And if you're resonating with suffering, that's going to be unpleasant by definition, right? And so even if it leads to a pro-social outcome, because I've now resonated with your suffering, for me, that subjective experience is not pleasant. And that ties into the prediction work, right? So what we were able to demonstrate was if people make the prediction about that resonance, they start shutting it down as a way to avoid it if they feel they don't have the resources. So that's probably what's happening as well.
So we have a number of additional, questions. The more answers you provide, the more interesting questions come up, which is great. I mean, one thing I thought was really fascinating about your recent paper, the one from 2021 in healthcare. I mean, the model with the outcome of personal accomplishment and the prediction of felt personal accomplishment from mental state inference, and also perspective taking. And I wondered if, I'm thinking about other work I'm familiar with like instrumental emotion regulation and the idea of understanding like efficacy of impact of one's pro-social emotions and actions. And I wonder if there's a way to use that to sort of facilitate more successful and well-regulated forms of empathy in an optimal direction in those settings. So for example, if you were to tell medical professionals, get them to anticipate the personal accomplishments that would result from successful mental state inference, is there a way to sort of work backward from it as a manipulation, or as a way to see the interconnections between empathy and effective outcomes in some cases, not all, of course, but in some cases, potentially?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The closest we've done to that is we have some work in a different domain. This is in the bias domain, looking at sort of racial bias responses, where what we do is very similar to what you described. We get people to anticipate sort of achieving a work-related goal and using that as a way of short-circuiting bias responses. So bias is also an affective response, which suggests that it might be effective for empathy as well, but we haven't tried it in empathy. I think that's really something interesting that we could do. The reason we think it's effective is because when I focus on my goal, let's say my goal is to be, let's say I'm a creative professional, this is the context we did it in, and my goal is to be as the best creative professional I can be so I can win awards. That requires me to be really novel in my storytelling and the bits of media communication that I'm creating as an advertiser. Well, if I rely on stereotypes, I'm going to regurgitate what's already in the market, right? Because everybody's relying on their stereotypes. So I need to sell a cleaning product, I put a woman in a kitchen, right? That's what everybody's doing. But if I focus on that goal, what happens is my bias doesn't trigger a stereotypical representation when I think about this cleaning product. And I end up being much more novel in how I come up with solutions to the communication that I need to create. So it's a way of sort of sidestepping the emotional reaction that you get. That might work in this empathic context as well, like you described. So if we get the medical people to focus on their goals regarding their personal accomplishments, the things they're getting into medical school to do and to accomplish, then getting inside of people's heads may be central to that, depending on what that particular goal is, if it's helping people recover from a long-term illness, let's say. So understanding that person's experience is central, but that might allow them to sidestep the sort of deleterious effect of empathy that might result from that. Where because I'm obsessed with the goal, I'm just going to the person's mind, not letting that then cascade into the empathic response. Or if it does cascade into the empathic response, it doesn't have the same negative impacts that it might otherwise have. So I think that's something that's worth trying, definitely. I see Lynn's question here is really interesting, Daryl. Can we take that one next?
Yeah. So Lynn asks, applying this work or this framework to empathy with executioners, how do they control their emotions?
Awesome question, and something that has kept me up at night for a long time. So instead of executioners, I'm going to substitute terrorists because they're often executioners. So there's some interesting anecdotal evidence from captured ISIS fighters who have been videotaped beheading people to make their propaganda. And these guys aren't monsters, right? They're people with families who are showing love and care and concern and compassion to their family members and other in-group members. So the question is, well, how can you then go ahead and behead people in the day and cuddle a baby at night? And we think this flexible idea has something to do with it. So again, when I'm about to do the beheading, I can switch it off, chop the heads off, go home at night, switch it back on and be a loving parent. Now in interviewing those ISIS fighters, what the researchers have discovered is that they often need some assistance in doing that and sort of making that kind of regulation. So many of them would talk about sort of taking a bunch of psychedelics to sort of distort reality before they would engage in the beheadings, suggesting that even though it might be possible to regulate, you're also aware of what's happening. There's also anecdotal evidence from death squad members in Nazi Germany. So there's this wonderful book by historian Browning, which talks about these guys. And a lot of them, he would report, would intentionally miss their shots, right? Because it wasn't possible for them to engage in the killing. Now, when you're in a death squad and everybody's firing at the target, you could sort of hide and miss shots in that context. Again, underlining the idea that these aren't horrible people. And a lot of them got involved in the death squads really because they didn't have much of a choice, right? So I think it harkens back to sort of Hannah Arendt's point about the banality of evil, in that it's really evil context that drives the behavior, not necessarily evil people. Not to say that we don't have psychopaths and sociopaths out there, but the ability of everyday people to engage in these behaviors is such that the context creates a scenario where it's now possible to do this kind of horrible act without it necessarily depending on or weighing on your humanity. Now, related to that idea, there's other work I've wanted to do for a really long time, looking at whether that's actually true, in the sense that many people, soldiers who return from active combat, often suffer from PTSD. Is one of the reasons you're experiencing PTSD because you've been regulating your empathy, right? Is it because you had to regulate it to engage in the horrible acts of war that you have to engage in? And then once you return to the real world and it's switched on more regularly as you're interacting with friends and family, you're remembering what happened back then, and you're now reevaluating that and adding empathy to it, which is making it distressing. So that's some work we've been wanting to do for a really long time, but sadly there's only one me. So I haven't gotten around to doing it. But we do know that the military trains their personnel to sort of regulate in the same way there's a hidden curriculum in medical school. Police officers are also trained in this way as well, which might explain some of the police shooting violence that we've seen as well. So a really, really interesting question, right? Because our theory suggests you don't have to be a horrible person to do this. And then finally, we've done one study recently where we've done a torture paradigm. So right after the most recent London attack, we, by coincidence, were running this torture study where we brought participants into the lab, gave them the cover story that we had captured someone who was recently, we think, involved in an attack, and there might be another attack, so we need to get information out of them. And then they go through a number of different torture techniques. We pull these from the international human rights groups as the most popular torture techniques that governments use. And they have to pick a number in terms of intensity for how much they want to torture that person. And what we're measuring in that study is two things. One, what's that initial number that they pick? And secondly, how they find that number. So there's a hidden number that's the right number for each trial. And what's your search strategy when you get incorrect feedback the first time? Do you automatically become more extreme, or do you take a more conservative approach where you're slowly increasing the increments, for instance? To make a long story short, in that study, what we're doing is we're zapping the brain using TMS. So we're shutting off a part of the brain involved in logical reasoning and sort of social conformity, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And what we find is that we can literally change search strategies by changing this brain region. And we can also change the initial intensity that participants are coming in on. But that only works for the more psychological forms of torture. Things like putting someone in solitary confinement. For the more physiological forms like kicking and hitting someone, doesn't really have much of an effect. So there are some nuances there with the executioner that we haven't been able to address by attacking this regulation brain region, but really fascinating stuff. And the anecdotes are sort of motivating me to learn more, but it's really hard to do these studies. It took us 5 years to figure out how to do the torture study ethically, because you can't really study stuff like this in an ethical way. So.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is fascinating to think about how empathy regulation, the continuities between, everyday empathy regulation and more extreme violations. So we have a few more questions. Let's see. So interesting. So Ileana, one of my students, asks, she says, "Thank you for this fantastic talk. Going back to the point about therapy, how do you think inefficacy inherent in over-engaging with empathy relates to some of Paul Bloom's recent arguments against empathy, in particular where Bloom does talk about empathy being problematic even in interpersonal relationships, where perhaps over-empathy with a close relationship partner who's suffering might end up actually hurting the coping process somehow. And interestingly, does the existence of a relationship you can't disengage from in the ways a medical doctor or therapist would. So if you can't separate from the context in the way that you were mentioning DCD's work is showing, does that complicate empathy regulation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It also ties into Walter's question below where he asks, do college teachers empathize with their students? How much should scientists empathize with their lab members, etc.? I've thought about this in terms of parenting relationships. So once I had a kid, I realized that I had to regulate my empathy to my kids, right? So when your kid is complaining for another treat and they've already had enough treats for the day and there's tears in their eyes and they're really tugging at your heartstrings, the human or the empathic thing to do is to give in, right? Because you want to relieve their suffering. But as a parent, you have to regulate that feeling and you have to say to yourself, this is going to have long-term negative consequences. And the kid doesn't understand that at the moment, right? They don't realize that they're predisposed to diabetes and more sugar at this age is a bad thing, perhaps. Or just the fact that they're just not going to go to sleep if I give them another candy bar. And so what I have to do is regulate any empathic response I might have to that child. And I've thought about that quite a lot. Now, I haven't done any experiments on it, but I think that when you're in those kinds of relationships that you described, Ileana, where you can't sort of get out of it, even then I think you have to learn how to regulate it somehow. And I don't have the right answer, right? Parenting is hard and I haven't figured it out. I'm always worried my kids think I'm a horrible person because I've hid the snacks. But I think it's something that you have to grapple with in close relationships as well, because there's always the possibility that the empathy is going to lead you to a negative outcome, at least in some of these situations. So in terms of how that relates to Bloom's work, I don't think I would go as far as he does. But I think that there might be something there regarding how it affects the coping process, right? Because I think what we need isn't empathy all of the time, right? People are really complex and contexts are really complex as well. And what we really have to do is find ways of targeting the right psychological process at the right time. So there are times within a relationship where empathy is required, but there are other times within that same relationship where it isn't. And I think being able to monitor and detect when it is that you need it and when you don't, that's really the skill that we have to try to be cultivating in people. So appropriate empathy, if you will. And I think that's what I take from Bloom's work. I know that's not what he means because he goes very far, but that's as far as I'm willing to go, right? It has to be appropriate and match the context. So as a lab manager, when I'm running participants in my experiment, right, I have to empathize with the participant, if only because I want to get good data. So I need to sort of consider, am I distressing this participant? Because if they're too distressed, then it's not going to work. My experiment isn't going to work. But at the same time, right, I have to do things to participants like administer mild electric shocks that I know might be unpleasant, but I can't really think about the degree of unpleasantness. So it's about finding a balance and also picking your moments when to empathize, right? So before the experiment, after the experiment, tons of empathy perhaps. In the middle of it, maybe less so. But I don't have good answers to that question. I think they're really, really hard questions and we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, as a parent of two myself, I definitely empathize, pun intended, with the trade-offs. Actually, with my class today, we talked about there's some work looking at the parent-child stress empathy trade-offs, like parents who are more empathetic on the IRI report showing more physiological stress, even while their children show less physiological stress. And so it's sort of interesting, the parent-child example. And Fred also chimes in to note that some of like situations, and I guess in some Buddhist scholarship about different forms of compassion and how to incorporate rationality into compassion. It's quite interesting. So let's see, a couple more questions. Walter, thanks for chiming in, Walter. So let's see. So in terms of scientists empathizing with lab members, using empathy research in your own life, I think you mostly addressed that, unless there's anything else.
Yeah, I would just say to that, Walter, I'm terrible at using research in my life. Like I compartmentalize very well and I don't even think about it. So I need to work on that, I think, definitely.
And then Julian, you have another question. And this relates to part of what Ileana said, I think. So the perceived dependency of patients or the intensity of the situations. So basically with someone who has a somewhat lowered calibrated perception of their patient's dependency perform better. Someone who continuously cares for more vulnerable patients who have higher dependency, so with the pediatric medical professionals, for example, would they be at higher risk? So yeah, I guess the role of different kinds of care and the role of severity.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we never found severity in our study, Daryl, but that's one study. I think severity might matter and frequency as well. So I think a GP has a much easier task than a person working in an elderly care home, for instance, in that the degree of suffering isn't quite as intense. I love the hospice example, right? Because that's a situation where you know that you can't help the person get better, which is often the goal for medical care. But what you're trying to do is making them more comfortable. So I think in the hospice scenario, it's very different. That your goal has to be empathy, but you also need to be able to be detached enough from them that when they eventually pass away, you don't feel it as a loss, because people are dying all of the time in that context. So I feel like in the case of, let's say, a COVID doctor under ward, there's a chance you might save that person, right? But in the hospice scenario, there isn't any such chance. That's why they're in your facility. So I think those people may come at it very differently. Maybe they may be trained to not think about the negative aspects, but the positive aspects, right? Perhaps death as a relief from suffering, or try to make the person's experience as comfortable as possible, those kinds of things. But there really isn't any good research I've come across looking at that. So I think it remains an open question. But it does suggest that this idea of matching empathy to context is really, really important. And that's a context where I imagine you would need tons of empathy because your goal is different. Your goal is sort of to empathize and to make sure that the person is as comfortable as possible, so that you have to resonate with their suffering in order to do that, knowing you're not going to help them. So when the negative outcome occurs, it's not as negative. But really great question. I hadn't thought of the hospice case before. So it's sort of thinking about further, I think. Yeah.
So last call for questions for Dr. Harris. I guess one question I have, and this is based upon something we were chatting about in the meet and greet before your talk. I know you'd said to, and this is something we could return to in future as well. I mean, something you were been fascinated by recently is just the contours of the definition of empathy, but also the notion of empathy as an unfolding process over time. And you alluded to it in your talk, but I was wondering if you had any other thoughts about, as more work is looking at motivational influences on empathizing, are there any promising ways in which you foresee further examination of time course and getting better resolution on the constructs of interest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I think this is a problem all emotion research suffer from, which is the lack of careful attention to time course. So this isn't unique to empathy. But I think we have the tools in emotion research to really go after this, right? Because we often measure emotion in continuous ways, either with diary studies or using physiological approaches, right? Where we're getting multiple time points and multiple reports of the experience. I just think we need to bring those techniques to bear in the study of empathy and all emotions more generally, right? So if I'm doing an empathy study, what I should be concerned about isn't whether the person felt empathy or not, but when did they feel it, for how long, at what intensity, and how did that vary over time? Because maybe I have an immediate empathic response when I first start resonating, but then I make some additional predictions or I update my predictions based on that experience. And the way that empathy is experienced begins to change as I start either trying to regulate it or increase it, or as I actually engage in the helping behavior, which is relieving the suffering. So I think it's a problem not just for empathy, but for all of emotion research. But I think we have the tools to go after it. So I would encourage researchers to use more diary approaches, right? Use more sort of physiological approaches so that we can see this process unfolding over time. Because understanding that I think is going to be critical, at least in my lab, for sort of making the points that we're making about the flexibility. But also, I think for getting a better understanding of what empathy is. The time course is really, really crucial to understand. So definitely, but do as I say, not as I do. We haven't done that as yet. We will at some point when we can do physiology studies again, but we haven't looked at that as yet. But it's something I've thought about a lot, especially over the lockdown period, I think, mainly because maybe I've been stressed with the kids trapped at home, but who knows?
Yeah, it's certainly, certainly the COVID period has presented a lot of empathy regulation prompts in various directions. And I guess one last question, another one from Ileana, and this has to do with the role of context that you were appealing to. Building off of like the Ray and Fisk perspective on relationship regulation, relational models, and how you might have different regulation demands in different relationships. So especially, I think she's seeing the juxtaposition of the compartmentalization piece. So like some of the DCD work and some of the other work you had done on like separating context. Is it one example of the relationship regulation that Ryan and Fisk talk about? It's like navigating social and moral responses more broadly as a function of the type of relationships you have with different people in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the case. I hadn't made that connection before, but I'm a big fan of that work. And I think it could extend to empathy as well. It's interesting to think about it in that context, but at least my initial response says absolutely right. Different relationships have different demands in terms of the expectations we have in those relationships and the predictions we have as well. And I absolutely think that it should matter, to be quite honest. So a parent-child relationship is fraught with all kinds of empathic traps, and is also much more enduring than other kinds of relationships. So I think time course is relevant there as well. Versus a boss-employee relationship is very different, right? So there's lots of work showing that bosses fail to consider the minds of their employees, but employees are constantly obsessing about what their bosses are thinking. So there's some differences in how each partner in that relationship might use empathy and approach empathy that are interesting to consider. And those differences change as you go to different types of relationships as well. So I think, yeah, I'm going to think more about that definitely, but at first blush, I think it does relate, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on 2 p.m. Eastern. And then I think that's all the questions for now. I thank you all for your insightful, provocative questions. And thanks, Lasana, for giving a great talk. This is very, interesting work, and it nicely builds a lot of the recurring themes over the past several weeks about understanding the different contexts in which we feel empathy. It's been great having you here at Penn State, even if only on Zoom. It is nice. I mean, one advantage of being on Zoom is the ability to, it's probably a lot easier to do this than to travel from the UK, especially at this point. But it's been great having you here. Thanks again. And the recording of the talk will be up soon enough. And just thank you again for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Daryl, and thank you all for attending. This has been fun.